Welcome to Into Africa. My name is Judd Devermont. I am the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I was the National Intelligence Officer for Africa and worked at the National Security Council. This is a podcast where we talk politics and challenge paradigms. On deck today, Malawi is preparing for a competitive presidential election. Will we see another leadership change in sub-Saharan Africa? Jumia, an e-commerce company, had a blockbuster IPO listing, followed by a sharp decline. What does it mean for the Africa tech sector? Plus, we have a special mashup episode with some of our favorite podcasts, Uhafamu Africa, On Africa, and the Africa Tech Roundup. What is the potential of this medium in a region where internet penetration is low and radio is still king? So whether you have a history with the continent or you're a newcomer, we want to get you into Africa. Malawi is headed towards general elections on 21 May. This may be the most competitive election remaining in the 2019 season. Are we on the precipice of another leadership transition? Africa's 27th since 2015? Joining me to discuss this too close to call election is Yi Dionne, an assistant professor at UC Riverside and co-host of Uhafamu Africa, Rachel Beatty Reidl, an associate professor at Northwestern University and also co-host of Uhafamu Africa, Travis Adkins, who is an adjunct professor at Georgetown's African Studies and Security Studies and the host of On Africa, and calling all the way from South Africa, Andile Masuku, who is an entrepreneur and the host of the African Tech Roundup. Kim, can you break this down for us? Why is this important? Who's running? What should we be worried about watching for?
Well, it's an important election because it's going to be really competitive. So Peter Mutharika is the president of Malawi, and he's the incumbent, likely favored to win. He's running for his party, the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP. His current vice president, Silas Chilima, has left the party and is running against him under a new party banner, the United Transformational Movement. So we have this new party emerging with this essentially a political outsider, right? Silas Chilima was a businessman before he went into politics. He never held public office before becoming the vice president for the DPP in the most recent election. And he's running against what he's calling a corrupt government and a corrupt party. Now, he's not the only challenger, right? So the longtime opposition challenger in this race is Lazarus Chakwera, who's the flag bearer for the Malawi Congress Party, the MCP, which many people may remember as the long ruling party under one-party rule under Hastings Kamuzu Banda from 1964 to 1994. There were 12 people who filed papers to run for president, and there's 7 people still running in the race today, but it's really going to be a race between these 3.
I'm kind of obsessed with Lazarus Chakwera, and I'll tell you why. He's the head of the former ruling party, head of the opposition, a guy from the religious side, and there's a growing trend of religious leaders entering politics. I don't think there's been a former ruling party that's been out 20 years and has a legitimate chance of coming back to power. And if he wins, and it's a big if, I think there's a lot of work that we could be doing and thinking about the resilience of political parties. Rachel, what do you think about this?
To be out for that amount of time and then to have this real chance, I think speaks to a number of possible mechanisms, right, that are at work. It could be, right, the networks, the personal charisma, right, the personalist aspect of it. It can also be the material inducements. To what extent did the party allow for that kind of accumulation and be able to maintain it over 20 years in the wilderness in opposition? That's a long time. So this is absolutely an outlier in terms of a kind of successor party coming back. And so, is it the ideology, kind of the brand name that carries? And I think there are, some aspects of those all in combination.
We're going to be honest and say that Malawi doesn't get a lot of attention here in circles in Washington, D.C., but how does the Southern African community see this? Andile, are people talking about Malawi?
Well, look, people in my circles are either preoccupied with South Africa's own elections, or quite a few are still focused on helping Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe recover from Cyclone Idai. And I'd be lying if I said it was as topical as it could or should be in this part of the world, or any part of the world, frankly. More so here, given how close we are. But personally, I see the development around Lazarus, Chakwera as being part of a disturbing trend towards the normalization of the merging of church and state, which is becoming an issue. And I think it's even as a sort of conservative Christian myself, I do worry about the trend and its potential to usher in some disturbing trampling of rights to freedom of worship and perhaps the legislation of morality and issues of that nature.
In a future episode, we're going to have to talk about religious leaders transitioning into political leaders, and we could talk about Nigerian's Vice President Osinbajo, who has a very similar sort of profile as well and potentially could be a candidate in 2023. Kim is here. She's a Malawi expert. Her book, Doomed Interventions, The Failure of Global Responses to AIDS in Africa, is phenomenal. I just quickly read it just before she got here, and I'm very happy I did. It's actually going to improve some work I'm doing on a couple issues. So one, I want to make sure people know that if you want some really interesting analysis and understanding about sort of global priorities, and then specifically to Malawi, you should read her book. But second, I found on Twitter that the UK has done this exercise in which they did a simulation on how the Malawians and partners would respond to the elections. And I'm curious to come back, in a couple weeks and see whether or not this really did improve the quality of the poll, or at least the response if things go wrong. Kim, let me give you the final word on Malawi.
So I think that exercise of practicing was a really good idea. I don't know how much it would, pan out in a real setting, but I think just having done it in the past, just like it's like anything in life, right? Practice is always good.
Right.
But one concern that I have about the elections is that the president recently, he was making accusations about the potential for the election to be rigged, right? And that in particular, that the mobile phone networks would be involved, right? That the two major mobile phone providers are Airtel and TNM Malawi. And it turns out that his former vice president, Salish Chilima, used to be the president of Airtel in Malawi. And it's for those reasons, and for the reasons of us seeing other leaders in other neighboring countries turning off social media, right, turning off access to mobile networks. It's for that reason that I'm concerned that there may be some sort of manipulation that could happen, right? The president could make a claim that he needs to turn off the networks because he's trying to protect the polls from rigging. And it's when those networks are turned off that I'm just wondering, how will the parallel vote tabulation happen, right?
That's a really good point.
So for those of you who don't know, a parallel vote tabulation is like a quick count. It's where they send a group of trained observers to a randomly selected nationally representative set of polling stations to try to get kind of the pulse of what the national vote count would be. And those observers send that information back using SMS messages. And if the network is down, they're not able to do that. And the Malawi Electoral Commission only has 7 days to count the votes. And so if mobile networks are down, it just raises questions about the veracity of the outcome.
Those are really good points, and we'll be watching them as the elections unfold. I want to pivot to the Jumia IPO.
The uniqueness of Africa is for the sellers. It's very hard to distribute their products. In Africa, there's very little retail, and the solution is to go online and go on Jumia.
Jumia is an e-commerce site that had this huge opening on the New York Stock Exchange. There sparked all of this buzz about the African tech scene. There's also been a lot of pushback on Jumia and, whether it does represent Africa. So, Andile, can you help us separate fact from fiction a little here? Like, what does this, public offering really mean?
Let me give you a balanced scorecard here. Firstly, there's this giant spotlight on Africa's startup ecosystem in a way that, is somewhat unprecedented. That's a fact. So from that standpoint, capitalism is winning in a big way. There clearly seems to be an insatiable appetite in places like the US for profit taking via what I consider PR engineered big ticket, quote unquote, investment opportunities. And I did say on my show, that I'm old school, so I'm not a huge fan of speculation, particularly speculation that doesn't adequately account for objective realities and actual business value. And the objective reality here is that Jumia is a hugely, hugely, hugely loss-making business. People like me and others believe there will be a bubble. The global financial cycle does its thing, and at the point it bursts, all these sort of speculative valuations applied to companies like Jumia and others will go out the window for the most part. If I lean into some of the proponents for this notion that this is just a glorified pump and dump scheme, well, you have its largest shareholder, MTN, holding 30% of that business, tipped to sort of sell out completely of that investment, at this very opportune time. That's part of what, a lot of people have a problem with, this idea that, brand Africa is being dragged into what might be a very unhealthy sense of, the creation of commercial value without actual business value being created along with it. And should a bubble burst and the Titanic that is Jumia go down, the sort of rosy picture of the sort of African opportunity might very well go down with it.
Kim, have you been thinking about this?
I have been. I mean, I see a lot of parallels to other ways Africa is engaged with by the rest of the world. And I'm so annoyed by Jumia and what people are making of it, because there's so many other amazing entrepreneurial ventures on the continent that deserve this kind of attention and aren't getting it just because of the power of networks, the way that's divided by race. And I'm also just thinking, like, when Jumia fails, everyone's going to say, we tried that Africa IPO thing, but it didn't work.
We've always understood, living here and doing business here, that everything that's worth doing takes time. Mm-hmm. And it seems like there are these superlative notions around growth and capturing value that are hugely popular in places that frankly don't have the value and I suppose have to trade on the basis of stories.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then they project these narratives. So the fact that, they intentionally spun this tale tells you something a little bit about, just how, well stories work in terms of like putting people in a position to win in cold, hard capitalist terms, but also how willing people seem to be to take short wins, because in the interim, I mean, we all know who's winning from things like this, and all the sort of upside risk, basically, I mean, we as Africa, like, bear the brunt of it.
So is this that the folks from Jumia are inauthentically claiming to be African, or that outsiders are kind of trying to draw this out as a diamond from the African rough, right? Because there's also the desire and the pattern from the West and other places in the world to do that. Or is it Jumia playing into this desire for external powers and thinkers and leaders to pull out these kinds of diamonds from the rough of Africa?
I think there have been a lot of really smart individuals paid, perhaps corporations as well, to figure out an angle that would appeal to certain targeted investors who might be on some level ready and poised to give Africa a chance, but needed something that sounds like, something that sounds like perhaps something they've invested in before, run by people they can trust, former McKinsey Oaks, who happen to come out of France, and yes, they did the right thing. They brought some locals to the table as founders, quote unquote, early on. And of course, it's an Africa-focused business. It's in 19 countries. 30% of it is owned by one of the largest, sort of most successful telcos on the continent. Yes, we are African, except you're not in many respects, and you know it. And many of the interviews that have been, many of the interviews that the founders of this business have sort of given since the event betray the very fact that, they know where the holes are in the story, but they know that the story is at least strong enough to hold its own in a place like the US, where the market can't wait to speculate on something of this nature?
Well, I think we should keep talking about Jumia, and I think, Andile, the risk that it holds for other tech startups. This is a really special episode, and it's bringing together some of our favorite podcasts. And we wanted to talk about this art form, its evolution, and what that means for African audiences, for American audiences. And so this segment's going to play on all of our platforms, but you'll get a little of the Into Africa, you'll get a little of the Uhafamu Africa, you'll get a little of Tech Roundup, you'll get On Africa. So you're getting 4 episodes for the price of 1. You may be getting 1 episode for the price of 4. I'm not sure. But, I hope that our audiences, our shared audiences, will discover each other's shows through this mashup. So I am not the host anymore. We're all sort of sharing MC responsibilities. So maybe, Kim, can I hand it off to you?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm actually really curious how everyone came to launch their podcast. So for me, it started because I'm a product of public investment in education, and I worked at an institution where you had to pay $70,000 a year to learn what I had to say about African politics. And I just felt that was entirely unfair. And I didn't want to only be teaching a certain, small handful of students every year who paid this incredible price to learn. And I thought, if I did something like a podcast, something that someone could listen to on a treadmill, or on their walk to work or commute to work, I might reach a different group of people.
Rachel, am I wrong in saying that you helped, keep this amazing podcast alive a little bit, reinvigorating it?
Oh, yeah, she definitely resuscitated it.
Well, I've always been such a fan of Kim's work and so appreciative of it. And so as I was coming in to direct our program of African Studies at Northwestern University, I really wanted to have an opportunity to think about the ways of extending what we create here, in these walls, the conversations that we have, and thinking about how we can reach broader audiences, both in terms of input and in terms of learning. So what I love about the podcast, it gives us an opportunity to curate a set of questions that we want to talk to other experts about and learn ourselves. And I think that creates a set of next generation questions. So I'm so thankful to be a part of all of it.
We're thankful that you guys, got the band back together, or however you want to say it. Travis?
Yeah, I think for me, there was a series of events that I think led to kind of On Africa taking form in the shape of a podcast. The first was around 2017. I actually faced a personal health challenge, which put both my life and my literal voice at risk. Coming out of that, with my life, with my voice, got me to thinking a lot more about voice, and especially being in kind of the Washington policy circle around Africa and really global circles where you don't hear the voices of the people from the continent. You don't see featured as many women as we should. You don't see featured people from the historic African diaspora as well as the contemporary African diaspora. And really, so there was a frustration there, right, of seeing panel after panel of essentially elderly white men talking about Nigeria, and the audience is filled with people from Nigeria. And then I think the last thing I would say is I saw many formats that had kind of the news run covering the whole continent. And I love those because I think it draws people in short spurts of time and gives them a maximum amount of information. But I also thought about the people who wanted to dig deeper and do a dive that was more contextual. And so the lens that we try to create is, with every episode, whenever you see this issue pop up in the news again, we want this episode to give you as deep of a historical context for following that issue as it progresses.
What about you, Judd?
Well, I'm going to give credit where credit's due. Kim was a big part of why I started a podcast. Our mutual friend Laura put that you had a podcast, and at first I was like, yes, I've been waiting for this. And then, of course, my second thought was, but I want to do that, right? Why can't I do that? And I worked in the government. I worked in the intelligence community. There was zero chance that I was going to have a podcast. And so when I came here to CSIS, that was one of the first things I wanted to do. What I wanted to do is help our audience think through the various issues that were on the continent, both reactions to news, which I love, but also some of these deeper dive questions, and then think about what the policy options that might flow out of that. There's a show I love called Bombshell, which is 3 really smart women who are national security experts, and they do this thing called, what is something that you follow like a sport but isn't a sport? And that's, for me, African politics. So whether we're, in an office, at the dinner table, at a bar, that's what I want to do. And so I'm hoping that our show, gives that sort of energy. And Andile, what about you?
So when I first started podcasting, I was I just come off a fairly successful run in television here in South Africa, working in front of the camera and behind the scenes. I was kind of feeling great about myself as a sort of producer and TV man, and a comedy of sort of political, sort of corporate errors led to the show being pulled. And so, it was somewhat a humbling experience that led to me trying to figure out what would come next for my broadcasting career. And so podcasting I kind of fell into as an experiment, as really an accessory to this, sort of high-flying broadcasting career I'd come kind of off. And the African Tech Roundup really was one in 3 sort of podcast areas that I sort of approached. I put my head together with a true sort of tech head, and I brought the broadcasting chops. And within a year, we realized that we hadn't built what we thought we were building, which was the sort of for us, by us community of Africans, by Africans, for Africans. What we'd actually built was a window into our ecosystem for everyone who wasn't here. Now, granted, we have a huge listenership on the continent, but 2/3 of our audience today is everywhere, is abroad. And so, we kind of fell into that, into that predicament of basically becoming representative, and then also having to face the sort of, again, humiliation of realizing just how exclusive a proposition podcasting remains on the continent itself. But I do espouse some of those, some of the mores of journalism, in as far as sort of trying to remain independent and fair, but totally wielding an agenda for the benefit of the continent.
Well, this is I think what we all struggle with a little bit, and it's twofold. One is for Kim and Travis and Rachel and I, like, how do you talk about Africa when you're not an African? And in my case, in Rachel's case, and Kim's not part of the African diaspora. And then the question, Andile, that you raised is, who listens to podcasts in Africa, right? Like, radio is still king, 27% internet penetration. Smartphones is about, what I was reading this morning, about half and half between feature and smart. Who are our audiences, given this platform's, this medium sort of limited reach?
It was really important to me when I launched the podcast that I center it on African voices, because I'm not African.
Yeah.
If you actually look, at our analytics, when we feature people from the continent, we actually get very good ratings. So, I love all of my American friends who have been on the show, but when the coup happened in Zimbabwe, it just happened that I was also meeting George Karikwaivanane, who is a scholar of law and the state in Zimbabwe. He was able to lend insights that I don't think very many people in the world could have. And that was one of our best listened shows ever.
We've been downloaded in about 30 African nations so far. The penetration is not as deep across the entire continent, but what I find is that spike goes up if the topic is on that country, regardless of who the guest is, right? But if you match it up where it's about a specific country and the guest happens to be from that country. So for us, one of the first episodes that really exploded into the kind of thousands of downloads is when we had Tundu Lissu, the opposition leader, member of parliament from Tanzania. And so many folks in Tanzania who supported him, who opposed him, who were curious about his emergence, tuned in to that episode. But I think there's a responsibility on our part in terms of how we frame it. We had our China-Africa episode, and one of the things we wanted to do there is not say, what are the Chinese boogeymen doing to the poor, infantile leaders of Africa, right? No, why are African leaders choosing from their own foreign policy perspectives to engage China?
We've never had an episode where we haven't had an African voice. And so that's critically important to us. But the other thing is, I'm an analyst, and I'm a product, former U.S. government analyst. I'm a product of that world. And so one of the things I hope is that, one, I'm being upfront with that. And Africans can hear my biases. And I want to be as clear as possible about them. And just as Andile schooled me a little bit on Jumia, like, I love that. That's the best part of the show, when I get, new insights from our guests, and maybe I need to do a course correction. Rachel?
Yeah, I think there's another kind of diversity that I've been really conscious of in terms of our Uhafamu Africa reach, and that is the linguistic diversity. And one of my goals has really been to think about how we can reach Francophone Africa, Lusophone Africa, right? And to have a platform, to let the podcast serve as a platform for exchange across the region.
And Andile, we get to hear all these U.S. folk talk about Africa. What's your reaction?
I think we need to become more brutally honest about the nature of our privilege. The fact that we're having this conversation in English, the fact that I have a sufficient level of education to articulate complex issues. I have a sufficient, and speaking about myself personally, I have a sufficient sort of exposure to the world, to my own country first, and to my own continent as well, and then to the rest of the world, to provide me a global context for everything that's happening. Podcasting represents what's easily, I think, the most exclusive media proposition to produce on the continent right now. If my objective is truly to include and truly to reach, never mind the fact that it's also happening in English, never mind, how much data costs and how much friction's involved in trying to listen. Despite all that, there's a pragmatic importance to the work someone like me is doing in influencing the earliest adopters of the technologies that allow us to interact with the rest of the world in unprecedented ways. Now, granted, most of us on the continent who get this privilege are fairly affluent. Many of us aren't necessarily representative of, quote unquote, the average African and their situation on the continent. And to some extent, I'm hypercritical of folks like you guys who sit over there in your fancy offices with, all those amazing grant funds, and you're sort of, privileged background.
He's mainly talking about me, I think.
Yeah. I was getting ready to
That's
say.
That's just me, right?
He's certainly not talking about me.
Yeah.
But I say that tongue in cheek, guys. I say that tongue in cheek because, again, perception sometimes is reality for some, So indeed. I say that tongue in cheek because it's possible for me to get on the soapbox and just miss how much goodwill is in the room, and how everyone's just trying to move the needle,
I mean, I think it's still important for us to keep that in mind and not to lose sight of that. But I thought it would be fun to kind of hear, some of what's your favorite episode of someone else's podcast?
What's interesting, I've really just learned from Andile's comments about thinking about podcasting as an exclusive format, and one of the most exclusive formats on the continent, because the way I've been approaching it has been like, this is a really low barrier to entry kind of field in some ways. I mean, like, I'm recording off my iPhone. It's so interesting to think about. And that's exactly where the value add of this exchange can lie, right? And thinking about how it can be both kind of low barrier and exclusive at the same time, and how those different positionalities create that. But to come back to the question, so one of the episodes that I really, really loved, and Travis already mentioned that this was one of their highest listenerships, was the episode on Tanzania. So I really learned a lot from that.
Travis, what about you?
I would say there are several, but I would say from Into Africa, I really appreciated the episode on the Sudan uprisings. And I myself had actually done a similar episode, but I really love to see how colleagues and peers take a similar thing and kind of turn it in a different way, and how this space is so wonderfully, collaborative rather than competitive.
Travis, so that's funny because the one I was going to pick was your episode with Nisrin El-Amin and Zachariah Mompili on Sudan, because I love that episode.
And Zachariah's been on all three of our shows.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah, so
so he needs to be on African Tech Roundup, I think.
Bring it on, man. Bring it on. Let's just throw our audience a curveball. Why not?
Yeah. Maybe I'll say, Andile, I've been listening to your show because Rachel turned me on to it, actually, but the episode that you did at the end of the year with Viola Llewellyn, like, she's a force of nature. Like, that was an incredible, it was a 2-part series, and it was phenomenal. And I think, I'm not a tech guy, I'd like to learn more about it, but what I love about your show is, I think, something that we're aspiring to do here at Into Africa, which the joy of the show.
That is like a high compliment. Like, if you sense some of the fun I'm having and the love that, you know, I just can't hold back, then, I mean, I'm winning. What I find fascinating about your approach is just so American. But I have to appreciate how you guys have turned into an art, you know, articulating the nuances of politics in a way that other parts of the world really don't do. You bring a sort of level of newsworthiness that I would never have sort of scratched deep enough to I don't know how to explain it. You know, it's just very American in a very good way. And then the one conversation you had on Uhafamu was, I remember, is one with Munandulo about the Mozambican crisis. I found that really interesting. Also, just because of how he just reminds me of my uncles, like people I know. You know what I mean? Like, but he's also just this learned man who just cares about his country.
Could I chime in just really quickly on that, Judd, and give some love to the Uhafamu family for the recent episode that you just had with a scholar on Islam.
Yeah.
And I thought that was amazing because
I haven't listened to that one yet.
Because Islam has such a place in the West, but to hear Islam and on a continent where 50% of people are Muslims, and to hear him give his perspective on the history and the context and the differences and the nuances is actually something that I was thinking of doing on the show. So I was so excited to see the way you did it and who you chose to do it and how it played out.
Uhafamu, obviously, I've been listening to from the beginning. I may have been on an episode. No one has to say it's their favorite, but that's okay. But the 2 episodes that you've been doing on protests on Sudan, the Khalid Madani one and then the one with Lisa Mueller, like, it's really actually helped me as I've had to have conversations here in D.C. about protests. I won't mention Matt Page and Hillary, who are friends of mine, and we're just rock star episodes as well.
They were. And, you know, that's the thing. If you want to increase your listenership, have people on who focus on Nigeria.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly.
Oh, my gosh. Matthew Page's, his episode right before the Nigerian elections was huge.
And then, Travis, you mentioned already, but the China-Africa one, I think, for me, was such an incredible perspective on the issue. We've only kind of put our toes in the water on China and Africa, and I thought, because it's so daunting, and I thought your guest did such a great job of a comprehensive issue that is such a political football here.
I wanted to say in closing, thank you guys for this idea. I think it's wonderful that we've all, you know, found a passion and an interest in a similar project and decided to sit down and do this together. So it's fantastic
it's
to
so
be
great.
here with you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. We want to have more conversations about Africa. Tell your friends, subscribe to our podcast at Apple Podcasts or wherever you find good content. You can also check out our analysis and reports at csis.org/Africa. Thanks.